everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today will be our first sewing pattern sew along. If you have not purchased this pattern, definitely check out my Etsy shop so that you can purchase, print out the pattern, and we'll be able to get started. Once you cut out all of your pattern pieces, it will look a little something like this. Make sure that you attach pattern A1 or 1A to pattern 1 so that you cut it as one whole pattern. There shouldn't be a seam or two individual pattern pieces for 1A and 1. The reason I separated it is because I thought it would be too long or too big of a pattern for us to put together since it's a print at home. But for step 1, what you're going to do is pin pattern 4 and pattern 3 together at the front split. From the waist, sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down to the mark that we added on pattern 3. Be sure to use a stretch stitch so that once the garment is complete and you are wearing it, the seam will have the capability of stretching alongside with the fabric. If you simply use a simple lock stitch, then 9 out of 10 it will pop as you wear the garment if it's, a stretchy fabric. So some machines will have different type of stretch stitches, but the one that I'm using is an antique. It's a Kenmore. The stretch stitch is actually it looks like 3 bars, almost like a lock stitch, but it has 3 individual lock stitches right next to it. So that's the one I'll be using to create all of the original seams, and then from there I'll be using a different type to serge it. Not a serger, because I know some of you don't have the sergers at home. So we'll just be using different stitches on that same machine to get the garment done. Always test your material before you start sewing your actual garment. So grab a piece of scrap fabric, test your machine, make sure that those seams, those stitch lines are looking crisp and clean, and from there you can start sewing your actual garment. Once you've sewn your split down, go ahead and open up the seam and serge each side of the seam allowance. Now that the split is fully attached, go ahead and grab some pins again. This time you are going to be pinning the waist. Pin the waist all the way across. Make sure that everything is nice and even. Be sure to keep your split seam allowance right in the front. Make sure to pin it open. That way it lays nice and flat and it's not a problem when you're actually finishing the split in the end. Your seam allowance for this will be a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And again, you're going to use the regular stretch stitch, which looks like a lock stitch, but with 2 more rows of lock stitches right next to it. Now that you have created the seam for the waistline, you can go ahead and top stitch. If you have the type of material that will fray, then I would advise treating that seam allowance so that it doesn't cause a problem in the long run. Be sure to keep the seam allowance going towards the upper portion of the garment so that as you top stitch, you're not actually top stitching over the actual skirt. If your material is not the type that will fray, like this velvet that I'm using, then you can go ahead and simply top stitch right across. Be sure to keep that stitch line nice and straight and even, because it is one of those horizontal lines that will definitely show if it is crooked or going wonky. So take your time with this step. Once you're done, you can go ahead and flip the garment over to the back side and trim a little bit of that seam allowance of the waistline off so that it's not so bulky. So this is what is looking like so far. You have 3 attached to 4 and 1A, of course. So from here we are going to be sewing our side seam. So grab your pins, lay the front and the back together, right sides together of course, and go ahead and pin down your side seams. Once your side seam is complete, go ahead and simply pin your sleeve. Make sure that it's nice and even and it's lining up. Use as many pins as needed. That way when we're sewing, we'll sew the side seams and we'll sew the sleeve as well. The side seam allowance is 1/2 inch. This time you're just going to use a regular stitching just like we're using for all of our seams. And then once you are done sewing your side seam, then you can continue on to serging, changing the stitch. We are using the serging stitch, as I like to call it. The garment is slowly coming together. Right now would be a good time for you to take a minute, trim off whatever loose thread that is hanging around, clean off the garment so that way in the end you don't have so much things that you need to clip, clean off and trim, and just start to get the garment to look like a finished garment. Front and back is already attached. Your sleeve should be complete. The only thing that is left to do is to add the elastic and also hem the sleeve and the bottom of the garment. So from this point, we are going to turn the garment inside out, and with your sleeve, you're going to fold it over twice and pin. Usually when I'm doing this step, I will iron the garment, that way it lays nice and flat, but this material in the pile is extremely finicky, and it just burns very easily, so I did not iron. But depending on the garment that you're using, definitely iron if need be. Simply fold the sleeve over twice, pin it, and you can use a regular top stitch right on top of that. If your garment is too thick, instead of folding it over twice, you can serge the bottom raw edge. Just fold it over one time and simply top stitch through that one fold. That way it doesn't become so bulky. With the area that has a seam allowance, or the seam I should say, try to trim it so that it's not it doesn't have extra bulkiness in that one little section where the seam allowance would be folding over twice. So kind of make a triangular cut without cutting the actual seam, and then from there you can fold it over and sew right across. Do the same for the side seam when you are hemming, and the same for the elastic when you're adding the elastic in. Definitely make sure you do that. But at the same time too, make sure that the same direction that the seam allowance is facing at the hem should be the same direction that it's folding over towards the neckline. Make sure that they're both going in the same direction. So if it's going towards the center back, the hem and the neckline should be going towards the center back. Once my sleeve hem was done, I went ahead and I pinned my split open. Pin it open, that way it's nice and flat and it's not giving you any type of like creases in the middle or going the wrong way. Just go ahead and pin it, that way it's out of the way. But you are going to have to hem before you do the actual split. I just went ahead and I put the pins there, that way as soon as I'm done hemming, I can just go ahead and finish off that split, and I wouldn't have to pull the garment away to lay the split down, even it out, and so forth. Whenever you can, make adjustments and make things easier in the long run, definitely you should do so. For the sleeve, you are going to keep the seam allowance at 1/2 inch, but ideally what you're doing is you're sewing relatively close to the folded edge. So make sure that you are staying on the folded material, otherwise your sleeve, it'll unroll, of course. But once you're done with the sleeve, you can move on to your hem. The hem I did end up ironing because the material was just, it was not staying in place with the pins. So I had to iron it down and pin it so that it would stay in place. Once you have completed your hem, the next thing to do for the bottom front would be to complete the split. What I would do is I would change my stitch over to just a simple regular lock stitch, because there won't be any tension added onto this, this stitch line, so it won't be a problem for it to not be able to stretch. So change it over to lock stitch. Make sure that your hem is folded inwards, and you are going to back stitch here at the bottom. Work your way all the way up towards the upper part of the split where the split actually begins. And before you pivot and you turn, you always have to make sure you sink your needle. So get into a proper placement where it's like, you should be like a ½ inch, if not like 3/8 of an inch above where the split actually begins. Sink your needle and pivot and turn your material with the presser foot being up, of course. Make sure you go directly across, like make sure that you're not tilting or going on an angle, because it will show. Sink your needle again once you've made your proper distance, and continue going all the way down again towards the hem. When you get towards the end, make sure you backstitch. That way it doesn't come apart, since it's just a regular lock stitch. Starting from the sleeve seam, I would add a pin there, and every 8 inches from there, use your measuring tape to measure, add another pin. These will be the markings that will match alongside with the markings that we're going to add on the elastic. The garment, every 8 inches you should mark it, and then for the elastic it's every 7 inches. Because there's a difference of 1 inch, the fabric will naturally wants to be pulled into the elastic. It'll sort of just like cinch it in place without forcing the material to have major gathers. I don't remember how many markings I had added on the garment. However many you need, then obviously just use that same amount for when you are doing your elastic. For the elastic, mark 1 inch in, and from there you can mark every 7 inches. So again, the same amount of markings that you had on the garment is the same amount that you'll need for the elastic. The elastic is a little bit smaller than the markings that we add on the garment because we need it to be cinched in. So be sure to not make it 8 inches just like we did with the actual neckline of the garment itself. Once you are done, you will take your elastic and you will match up those points with the garment. Starting at the sleeve seam, with the 1 inch marking that you added on the elastic, I would match it to that underarm seam. And then you continue on to match the markings on the elastic to the markings on the garment. Make sure to secure it with the pins, otherwise the elastic will come out. If you didn't use a tailor's chalk like I did on the garment, then when those pins come out, it gets very confusing as to where do you put them back. Luckily with this material, it leaves like the elastic, not the elastic, but the pins, once it goes through, it actually leaves like a small little marking on the garment. Like you could see the tiny hole from where the pin penetrated. But just keep that in mind as you are maneuvering through. I would say simply just use the tailor's chalk and mark it every 8 inches on the garment, just to keep you on the safe side. Now that your pins are in place, starting from the underarm where the seam was, go ahead and sink your needle into the elastic. That 1 inch, there's no stretch there, so you should just be zigzag stitching it regular. From the pin that's in the front, go ahead and use your hands, just tug on it slightly so that it's even with the actual material. So you don't want your material to stretch, you just want the elastic to stretch to match the 8-inch length, right? So technically between each pin you're stretching you're stretching the elastic the 1 inch so that it matches the actual garment. You're going to do that from pin to pin. Now when you are moving from the next pin to the next section, always make sure that you sink your needle. Never let go of the material unless your needle is synced in. If not, the elastic will pull back into itself and it'll throw off your stitch line because it'll want to go behind and to join the material that's in the back of the presser foot. So always make sure that your needle is synced in. Here is a different view. So first you're going to line it up to the fabric, making sure that your fabric is not being stretched but it's like perfectly flush to the elastic, and you're going to zigzag right above that. As you continue to go forward, you're going to sink your needle, adjust the material again, stretch it so that it's nice and flush, and then continue sewing. And do that until you reach your starting point. Now that the elastic is completely attached and your garment is practically done, before we do this next part, make sure that you trim anything that needs to be trimmed. Clean off the fabric, make sure everything is looking good. Always try to keep the garment tidy as you go on through the steps. That way in the end it's not a whole lot for you to trim and clean off and clipping threads all over the place. For this last part, we're going to turn the garment to the right side. We'll be top stitching a zigzag stitch right at the top where the elastic is. So go ahead and roll your material twice so that the elastic is fully encased, and make sure that you sink your needle in, and you can go ahead and start with the zigzag stitch. Always make sure to start at a seam, so whether it is a side seam or the sleeve, wherever you decide to start is fine as long as it's on a seam. Now there are some areas where the material will be a little bit more gathered. In other areas you'll see that it lays down flat on the elastic. For the area where it lays down flat, then there's no stretching that would be needed. But for the areas that you see that are a little bit more gathers on the elastic, you can stretch the material slightly so that it just simply lays flat, and continue stitching. And that is all for today. I hope you were able to follow along. If you have any questions at all, definitely drop them down below. There is a contact information on the sewing pattern. You can also email that too. But that is it. I want to thank you for purchasing my first pattern. I'm so excited. And this is an overall look on what the dress looks like. Now that you have created yours, I would love to see it. So post on Instagram, tag Tisimiwi so that we are able to add you to the highlights for this pattern. Thank you again for being a part of my growth and my journey, and I will see you next time. Happy sewing!